In the year 1867, when Canada was born, it exceeded the simplicities of a political merger. For the new federal government in Ottawa, it was a massive transfer of power over Indigenous populations and was ultimately the moment when they lost their legal standing. The BNA Act contained Section 9124. This transferred the power over Indigenous populations to the federal government in Ottawa from the British Crown. Not a single Indigenous leader was present as this decision was being made. John A. Macdonald was deeply involved in this transition and firmly believed that they had the right to control these populations. Due to the fact that Britain essentially claimed to own the land, they didn't grasp the severity of handing this level of control over to the Canadian government without any input of Indigenous communities. Without this specific act, the government would have never had the authority to build systems that we're familiarized with today. These systems include reserves, residential schools, and they would have never had the right to deem who was a status Indian.
In this section, we will be discussing the rising action of the Indian Act. Political leaders pushed for confederation for control over the land, controlling Indigenous peoples, and expanding into Indigenous territories for resources and colonization. The government wanted to unite under one federal system for stability and control. By introducing the Gradual Civilization Act in 1857 to assimilate the Indian people into Canada. However, the act failed, and in 1869, the federal government enforced the Gradual Enfranchisement Act to establish the elective band council system. It granted the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs extreme control over status Indians. These policies were used to limit Indigenous self-governance and confining them. Like an enfranchised, widowed Indian would not have any rights on what happens to her family. If she was deemed of good moral character, she could keep her children after the father's death. The government wanted to expand into the West for land and resources, and build a coast-to-coast country to prevent the United States' expansion northward. The Confederation of Canada pushed to group all Aboriginal groups under one law, to disregard the treaty rights and interests of Aboriginal peoples, and construct the intercolonial railway to connect the country politically and economically.
In 1884, the government changed the Indian Act to make the potlatch illegal. This ceremony was an important part of community life for many First Nations. It carried cultural, spiritual, and social meaning. By banning it, the government tried to weaken Indigenous traditions. By 1895, the ban expanded to include other ceremonies like the sun dance. These ceremonies were central to Indigenous identity, further targeting Indigenous spirituality and cultural expression. In 1914, the government increased control over daily life. First Nations people had to get written permission from the Indian agent to leave the reserve. This pass system limited their freedom and allowed the government to monitor their movements. In 1920, the act made residential school attendance mandatory for Indigenous children. Families were forced apart, and generations of children were subjected to assimilation and abuse. By 1927, the government made it illegal for First Nations to hire lawyers or raise money for land claims. This meant communities could not challenge the loss of their land in court. It removed their ability to defend their rights.
After 1927, First Nation communities began to resist government control more strongly. Indigenous people continued to stand up for their rights, culture, and traditions. In 1951, the government revised the Indian Act. These changes removed ban on culture ceremony that had prevented Indigenous community from practicing their traditions. Indigenous organizations began forming across Canada. Those groups worked together to demand fairness, equality, and self-determination.
Today, we still see the effects of the Indian Act in First Nation communities. It affects identity, land, and decision-making. Over time, some changes have been made. Unfair rules about gender were fixed so women who lost their status could get it back. Many First Nation communities are working towards self-governance. They want more control over their own decision, law, and future. The Truth of Reconciliation Commission helped raise awareness about residential school. It also created calls to action to guide healing. Today, people are still talking about the Indian Act and its future. Real progress happens when First Nation voices are heard and respected.